As a result of their contentious breakup, the Beatles were never the same. Numerous factors contributed to the breakup, including as John Lennon's romance with Yoko Ono, growing artistic differences, and a dispute over Apple Records' choice of Allen Klein as label head. The band's infamously rowdy 1968 album recording sessions for the White Album appear to have been the genuine beginning of the problems. Because he was sick of the atmosphere while the Beatles fought, Ringo Starr temporarily quit the band. Paul McCartney remarked, "There was a lot of friction during that album," when asked about the time spent recording. Even the thought of breaking up was stressful. To which John said, "The breakup of the Beatles can be heard on that album." John informed Paul, George Harrison, and Ringo that he sought a divorce from the Beatles in September 1969, following the band's recording of most of Let It Be, the Get Back sessions, and Abbey Road. In his despair, Paul set out to compose McCartney, his debut solo album, thinking that the band had already broken up. Nonetheless, the band eventually got in touch with John again, this time asking for his assistance in finishing Let It Be, which would reflect the soundtrack from the upcoming Get Back movie. Paul went back to the studio to record I Me Mine with George and Ringo, without John, who had departed. But they turned down the new album proposals despite the new mixes. In an effort to save the project, producer Phil Spector, who would eventually be found guilty of murder, was entrusted with the task of transforming the recordings into a fully functional album, which ultimately became known as Let It Be. Following John's shocking statement, Paul was planning to release McCartney at this time. The publishing of McCartney, alongside a press statement announcing Paul's resignation from the Beatles in April 1970, was something he supposedly discussed with his bandmates beforehand. The new album was rechristened Let It Be after the March 1970 single by the same name, and the release date was planned for May 1970, just after the film's premiere. However, Paul was unwilling to communicate with Apple since he disapproved of Klein, Paul's manager, so Ringo went to Paul's house with a letter requesting that he postpone the release date. Apple wanted to avoid a conflict, and Paul was also opposed to speaking with Apple. Ringo kicked the drummer out of his house after a violent argument with Paul. The album's release was the last act for the Beatles, and none of the band members were present for the film premieres. It was clear that John had moved on after leaving a year prior, and Paul had done the same with the April release of his debut solo album. With the release of Paul's first solo album, the world learned that the most renowned band in the world had broken up.